and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and with me, as always, is our Chief of Research, Derek Cohen. Derek, it is the interim. We're into March now. So how's the interim going? How's the research going? What kind of things are jumping out at you and things that we need to be talking about?
Well, I think it's surprising nobody that the big item that's grabbing every headline, everyone's attention right now are data centers. That tends to be the cause du jour, obviously, because that has serious implications both for our electricity grid and our water supply, and obviously everything, even when it applies there, is hyper-local as it begin with. But I think we're going to see this week the interim charges drop towards the end of the week, and I think that the hearings are going to start in short order after that.
That's some real nerd stuff right there, when everybody's waiting to find out.
When we're not even talking about policy, but what might we do about policy?
Yeah, right. So that'll be fun to watch. Okay, well, it is March, and so we thought maybe for the hot take here, we would talk a little bit about March Madness. It's a little early because the conference championships are happening this weekend. Selection Sunday is on this Sunday. But do you have any early picks for who's going to win or be competitive in the championship?
Well, I would be doing my alma mater a disservice, my alma mater Bowling Green, if I didn't represent Maction. Is how that would happen. So the fact exactly. The fact that they got Miami of Ohio going is performing as well as they did, or as well as they are, I should say. I think that's going to be a really interesting case. Now, of course, how this usually works. They're going to get, they might even get a decent seed and then bounced by, some play-in team.
12 seed, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Wichita State now, not Wichita State years ago.
Right.
But I think that it should at the very least be exciting. I was watching, though, and I have been following them a little bit. It is interesting to see. They barely squeaked Toledo, who, in terms of, MAC teams, because obviously people tune in to hear MAC basketball.
Yeah,
podcast,
that's it. They're the edge of their seat waiting for
this.
Yeah,
exactly. But no, they barely squeaked Toledo. So it's really, the dynamic is not this ascendant powerhouse in a mid-major conference. It's like, a team that nevertheless they persist.
Yeah. Well, it's when March Madness comes around, it's hard not to be a homer for your favorite team. I will be the anti-homer and say that even though Texas has surprised me in terms of their the wins and how well they've done in the SEC this year, every game I've watched they've lost, and so I will just do them that favor and maybe not in either. If I watch it, I know they're going to lose, or maybe I'll do them that favor and not watch it, and maybe they'll win.
I'm not that kind of doctor, but I do think that is a textbook case of battered Longhorn syndrome, which is a flanker of the ever dreaded battered Aggie syndrome.
Well, our guest today is from Utah, and she's a BYU supporter, so maybe we'll get her hot takes here in a minute after we jump into the intro. Well, of course, we had the primaries last week. That's everybody's still talking about kind of the aftermath of that. Last week's primaries produced a headline that has already sparked a lot of debate across the political world. For the first time in a non-presidential primary year since 2002, Democrat turnout in Texas exceeded Republican turnout by roughly 200,000 votes. Progressives were quick to celebrate the number as evidence that political momentum in Texas is shifting. And predictably, the familiar question started circulating again: is Texas turning blue? But as anyone who knows Texas politics close or follows Texas politics closely knows, primary turnout numbers rarely tell the whole story. Turnout can be shaped by a lot of factors: how competitive races are, which issues are driving people to the polls, and how motivated each party's base is at that particular moment. The bigger question isn't just what happened in the primaries on Tuesday, it's what those results actually tell us about the broader landscape heading into November. Are we seeing genuine signs of a shift in the state? If it is real, it would have long-term consequences for the future of Texas far beyond just this election. Elections aren't just about turnout, they're also about ideas. Voters in both parties were weighing competing visions for the state's future. Republicans debated issues like property tax relief, border security, education policy, including the role of parents and the future of school choice. We said school choice, so we've done our duty for the day. Democrats had their own internal debates about how progressive their agenda should even be and which issues they should focus on in a state that still leans to the right. And beyond the policy debates, there are long-term trends shaping Texas politics: population growth, migration into the state, shifts in voting patterns, and changes in how different demographic groups, especially Hispanic voters, are aligning politically. So today we want to dig into that data and the strategy behind the headlines. To help us sort through all of that, we're joined today by Sarah Steeby. She's the executive director of the Napolitan Institute. Previously, she served as director of communications for RMG Research. She led innovative initiatives at Young America's Foundation and Advocare International, along with numerous political and policy campaigns. The Napolitan Institute is known for its rigorous, unbiased polling and deep insights into the American sentiment. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here. Excited to talk about this looming question: is Texas turning blue? It never seems to get away
from us. The looming
us.
question is, are you picking BYU to win the national championship?
I mean, is there any other choice, I guess, for me? I think I got to go back home, I think, to my Cougars. So we'll see how they do. Often disappointing, but...
Okay, so then let's just jump in and we'll just ask you. So, how much should we be reading into, that's a big deal. It's 2026. It's been 24 years in an off-year election since Democrats outvoted Republicans in the primary. That was 2002. How much should we be reading into this data?
The Napolitan Institute, we're really focused on tracking trends. So what are the deeper currents that are going on in the country? We don't play a ton in campaigns, but in issues and looking at where is Texas going, it's important to remember that vibes don't win elections, but fundamentals do. So when you're looking at fundamental issues for Texas voters, it's always going to come back to the economy. How are people feeling about their personal finances, immigration? Do people feel like the border is secure and that we're dealing with illegal immigrants in the best way? And then when it comes to cultural issues, I think, again, we're going to see the transgender issues. How is that playing? And, this is a 77% issue in Texas. People don't want men playing in women's sports and they don't want men in girls' bathrooms. And that, I think, is an issue that's going to again play strongly. I have a little bit of PTSD from the last election cycle where I think I could quote Colin Allred and Ted Cruz's political campaign commercials about the issue, but it's still one that's concerning to parents, and it's one that is going to be a foundation again going into this election cycle.
But to be fair, the Democrat argument is not that necessarily people's ideas about the issues are shifting, but that the actual humans who will show up and vote will be different than the humans who showed up and vote the last two election cycles. Is there any evidence that will be the case?
I think the thing to look at, as you said, historically, there have been times when the Democrats have shown up stronger in the primaries, and then Republicans still won by double digits in November. What's important to look at is the overall field right now. We can talk about the Talarico effect. I know friends of mine, moms who are in Houston and Dallas, who for the first time decided to vote in a Democratic primary because they felt like they jived with the vibe of James Talarico. Well, when you look at the Republican side, it was heavily divided. And I think that there was a lot of baggage with a number of candidates here. And so Republicans may not have been as excited to show up in the primaries. But when it comes down to November, Republicans are going to want their team to win. And so while they may not have been strongly behind someone in April, looking at November, they're going to show up because they want their team to win. And it's a bigger fight. There's more at stake when we're going into November.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. Because I want to ask you, in terms of quanta, which is it? Is it more Democrat exuberance, Republican apathy, or are those two independent specters that move independent of each other?
Yeah, I think those are independent of each other. There's a lot of concern right now that the Trump voter base is not energized and is not showing up to vote. We just released some polling data on the generic ballot that shows the opposite. Trump voters are going to show up and they're enthusiastic about it. The biggest opportunity right now for Republicans is connecting with traditional Republican voters. They are not as enthusiastic. They likely were not the ones who showed up to vote in the primaries. And so how can Republican candidates connect with both the Trump voters and more traditional and maybe more center-right voters? And I think you'll see on the Democrat side that your turnout's likely to be the same. I don't think that there is a huge increase in Democratic voters from one year to the other, but they may be more enthusiastic about their candidate right now. The biggest challenge for the Republicans is how do we bring the party together and get them to show up?
So with that understanding, would the prevailing phenomenon be more? And let's say that it was a lot tighter, similar to what we had in 2018, Brian? Mm-hmm. Similar to what we had in 2018. Would that be a shared exuberance, or would it be a Talarico coat tail effect, or something of the like?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what Talarico does. Right now, voters don't know him as a candidate. They don't really know his policies. We're going to see a lot come out about Talarico. The vibe that he gives off, similar to Beto O'Rourke or even Obama, very likable, very charming, and very grounded.
Well, David French bought it.
Right, exactly. And when you look at the chaos that's happening on the Republican side, well, it's very easy to tell the story of Talarico being a great candidate and potentially a good fit for a lot of center voters. But the more they get to hear his policies, the more that they see that they're not aligned with supporting Texas families, then that's going to really impact, I think, the number of center-right, center-left voters that decide to go with the Democrats on this.
And this is what I call the perfect storm theory that we hear every 4 years, of course, which is that, you've got this, amongst the apathy amongst the Republican electorate, you've got this excitement, amongst the Democrats, you've got, a disliked candidate and a sort of not well known, but enthusiastic candidate as well. And they got really close in 2018. And I think that's really been an albatross across the neck.
Well, they got close in one race in 2016.
Right, they got exactly right. In 2018, they got close in one race, and that really has been more of an albatross around their neck ever since then. Because of course, you shift to 2022, and all of the statewide won by double digits. I mean, despite the fact that it was Beto O'Rourke at the top of the ticket running against Greg Abbott, but it seems like that 2018, Sarah, maybe has created some kind of false hope that now that instead of doing the things that a party needs to do in order to be successful, ground game and money and investment and all that kind of stuff, they're just hoping for the perfect storm is gonna materialize, and then they're gonna jump to the top.
Yeah, and I would caution right now, if you're looking at polling numbers between Talarico and the Republicans, I've seen in multiple polls that Talarico wins over Cornyn or Paxton. But there's really this interesting phenomenon that goes on when you're this early in the race, where a Cornyn voter will not admit that they would ever vote for Paxton in November, because right now they're fighting for their team. So you see Talarico up a few points. And the same thing with Paxton voters. There's no way they're going to admit that they would ever vote for Cornyn in November. But as we get closer and closer to November, you'll be able to see that shift where people want their team to win, and they'll kind of swallow their pride and get on board and support the candidate. But that's going to be the story right now, is that, Talarico has the votes, or he has the momentum, and this is what's going to change. This is what's going to start moving Texas blue, when in reality, there's chaos right now. A Trump endorsement is going to make a big impact. And so I just caution everyone to be very, very careful in looking at polling data right now, because it's not telling the story, and we can't play in the margins, and we can't play with likely voters yet, because it's just too soon to tell.
And it's worth mentioning that the poll that came out that you're describing was not a Napolitan poll, that it was in fact done by a very well-known Democrat operative who, of course, wanted to make headlines, and they achieved that as well. But let's jump into the data. I mean, it is true, and it's something that they have celebrated, which is true, is not only did they have a larger turnout than Republicans, the Democrats have a larger turnout than Republicans, first time in 24 years, but it was the largest percentage as a percentage of registered voters in Texas ever. And so the previous max had been 2002. It was about 8%. This is about 12%. So they did this is a huge jump, especially because we've added millions and millions of registered voters in Texas. And so, is there something more to that once you dig in the data? A lot of people were willing to just write off Texas and say this could never happen here, but there are sort of signs, at least in the data, that might suggest that something's happening here. Have you dug down into that, and are you seeing anything?
Yeah, I think there's a real fear of what Californians have done to Texas. And I will admit that I actually moved from California to Texas. So I'm one of the problem people, I guess. But I think what has to be remembered is that people moved from California to places like Texas and Florida for a lot of cultural and political reasons. So there's this fear that a huge influx from California is going to turn us blue. Well, in a lot of cases, it may in the short term actually turn us more red, because people are looking for similar values, places to raise their family that is aligned with what they believe. And so I don't think that has as much weight as a lot of people like to put into it. Another demographic that people look at is the Hispanic vote. And Scott Rasmussen can get on a soapbox about this one. Scott Rasmussen's the founder of the Napolitan Institute. So work closely with him. And a lot of Hispanic voters are actually really misrepresented and misunderstood. And they never vote the way that people like to predict that they will. Hispanic voters are often not categorized by the census, how they would self-identify. And so there's these two big groups, I think, of misunderstood people. The transplants that are coming in, likely not to have a huge impact because they're similar in values. And then the Hispanic vote is hugely talked about, but it's misunderstood and not predictable. So you have to look at what are the foundational principles, foundational values that are really going to drive people to vote. And that's likely something we just have to track and look closely at.
And I want to drill on that a little bit, because I think you bring up a really good point, specifically with Hispanic voters. Obviously, one of the big narrative takeaways from 2024, well, not just 2024, but as we've seen then, both there and I guess contrasted with the primary that we just had, is that basically folks are saying that Hispanic voters who in larger numbers than in years prior had shown up for President Trump and really represented an ascendant part of the Trump presidential coalition are now so disenfranchised with the mass deportation, or this is the narrative that we get from Washington, which of course presupposes that Hispanic voter is a monolithic entity and there shall broker no dissent amongst there. When in fact, I don't know if multilithic is the word, but that, polylithic, definitely containing multiples, I think we could say. It's a lot more complex like that, to your point. So the behavior in Hispanic voting, however quantified, do you think that there might be a wellspring, maybe on the policy front, that we can point to that say, if we see this particular outcome, it might be indicative of this, or that particular outcome might be indicative of that?
It's interesting. Q1 of this year, we've had a lot of talk about immigration and ICE and strong borders, all of these things. Our data still shows that Hispanic voters favor strong borders, that they still favor illegal immigrants being deported from the country. And 80% of Americans overall nationally think that legal immigration is good for America and illegal immigration is bad for America. So the immigration card, I just don't think is going to play with Hispanics or anybody as much as maybe some in the political class would like to think it will. When we're looking at Hispanic voters, I think a really good question for candidates to ask and to start speaking to is the question of who decides on any issue. If this is about education, should the federal government be deciding this? Or should it be a state issue? Or even more so, how are we empowering parents to be able to make really strong decisions? We know that family values, strong conservative family values, really play in the Hispanic community. And so that question of who decides is sadly kind of a novel way to approach issues and approach talking about policy. Should it be federal, or should we be bringing this closer to home, to the kitchen table, for parents to be able to decide on issues and to be empowered to build their American dream? And that messaging is going to play not just for Hispanics, but across the board. If you want to reach center right voters, that question of who decides should be top of mind for any political candidate this year.
Another interesting aspect of this election is the number of open seats that we have throughout the state. It's not just the we've got it's not open at the it might be open, I guess, if Paxton wins the primary, but we have with the AG, the state AG is an open one. The comptroller is an open one. I think, and is there more? There might even be one of the other ones. But amongst the state legislature, there are 21 open House seats, there are 5 open Senate seats, and 9 open congressional seats. And so you've got a lot of people who are going to be defining themselves for the first time with the electorate on various issues that they support and contrasting their positions on those issues against their opponents. What do you think is going to rise to the top? If you had to pick 2 or 3, primary issues that you think, these candidates are going to be defining themselves, right? Because it's different than just saying, I've been here, look at my record, vote for me again, reelect me. So many people are going to be trying to pick the issues that work best for their campaign. I'm curious what you think, issues are going to be that rise to the top that most people are going to be talking about.
The number one issue will always be the economy. We will say that until we're blue in the face. It's the economy. It's the economy, stupid. And more specifically, it's how do people feel about their personal finances? That is, people don't know all the things that make up a really strong economy. They don't understand what, is going to impact inflation. And not because they're stupid, but just because they have different priorities. And so how can new candidates talk about what they're going to do to help people's personal finances? That is going to be the best way to connect with voters. You have to understand that those of us in the political bubble may know who our state representatives are, but most people don't. And that's not saying that most people are bad or that they're dumb, but it's just there are different priorities. So reaching out of the political bubble and really understanding what's impacting people's bottom lines is going to be one of the top issues this year and every year. I think another issue that candidates can really bring to the top is more of addressing issues in a non-chaotic way. There's a lot of chaos going on right now with candidate baggage. There's going to be a lot of political campaigns that people aren't going to want to talk about. And we have this war in Iran going on that's not helping people really feel stable economically or just in their homes in general. And so how can we talk about national security in a way that helps to bring that down? How can we find a leader who is going to make us confident that our children are safe and that we're going to open doors for small businesses? Those are really simple things to talk to, but they're what really matter to the American people.
Yeah. You mentioned Hispanics. What about any other demographics that might, play in Texas politics this year? The left is always trying to get young voters out. They're always trying to, they're mostly on college campuses trying to get them to register and vote for the first time. But urban voters, rural voters. I mean, is anybody else other than, like you said, a lot of people are talking about Hispanics, but what are the other demographics that might play here?
Yeah, well, I can talk about a demographic that's close to my heart because it's who I am. But let's talk about moms of young families. These are some powerful women, right? They control a lot of the finances in the home. And I think we're seeing a real surge of a desire to be politically active, to stand up for their kids and for what their communities are going through. I find it very frustrating that a lot of places where I see my friends getting information they really talk down to their viewers. We'll say influencers are talking about politics in a way that really connects to the emotional core, talking about having strong and respectful communities who can have really good dialogue. But then when it comes to policy, they're preaching policies that are not in line with conservative Texas values that are actually at the core of what people want and what will create those strong communities. I think it's young moms, young families is a huge demographic that really could get engaged, could get involved, and could make a difference. And it's just not talked to in a way that makes center-right policies seem like a good idea, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask. So I personally am not a young mother. Brian, maybe. I haven't checked.
When does the demographic golf dad? When are we going to start deciding elections?
You're already branding the vest, Brian. So I mean, we can definitely do the math. But I think Sarah makes a really good point in the fact that I mean, this is something that potentially is, depending on how you slice it, at least in a state demo, we could be talking, upwards of dozens of percentage points there. And so with that, if you were, and again, generic candidate, Steeby here, but if you were to create I would say a messaging rubric or a policy portfolio to address the needs and the wants and the political desires of that particular demo, what would that contain, and where's the delta from kind of generic Republican or generic Democrat for that matter?
Mm-hmm. I think it goes back to that question I brought up earlier. Who decides? Who should decide what school my kid goes to? Who should decide how my family is going to build our business? That question is so empowering to moms, to golf dads. And it's just, which is important. But it's just also so different than the messaging from most political messaging in general. We know in the study that we do at the Napolitan Institute, we see our nation as a 10-10-80 nation. 10% on the right are arguing with 10% on the left. They're the loudest voices. And there's 80% in the middle that's just trying to keep their heads down and stay out of the political fire. Now, that doesn't mean, there's still about a 50-50 split, because some people are a little more center left and some people are a little more center right. But that 80% in the middle want common sense solutions. And I think that they're open. And the political world simply misses talking to this group of the 80%. They see the 80% as, well, we just need to get them more on the 10% size. Well, that's not true. They can be fine in the middle, but there needs to be policies and there needs to be communication that speaks to what their values are. And people really don't necessarily want to be far on one side or the other. They're okay with being in the middle because that's where their priorities are. And they also understand that our world is not black and white. It's a little bit gray. What a refreshing message for most people in the middle to be able to understand that our founding ideals of freedom, equality, and self-governance, there are people who can champion those ideas, and there are conservatives who can do that in a way that's still respectful and that still builds strong communities. So I don't know if that's my stump speech, but that's what I would say. How can we talk to the middle in a way that's respectful and that encourages those founding ideals that we know there is common ground on?
And I think that's a really good point. And I think we can say, Brian, she's running. But I think we can say, because I can't remember if it was like Jonah Goldberg or Yuval Levin's been making this point that it seems like we have become, even though we are largely, depending on where you put the fat part of the curve, we're a largely center-right nation, yet we flip back and forth between Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. And a lot of that tends to be representative that both major parties seem to be not only content, but even set on being almost a party of the minority to Sarah's case, because they're looking at so much of the stuff that, is animating, say on, I don't want to say the fringes, because that makes it sound I'm not trying to delegitimize that viewpoint, but things that don't necessarily, belong at the kitchen table of everybody in the state. You can differ on the policy, but people are talking about. That's why I think the data centers issue that we just discussed is such a big deal, is because everyone's like, ooh, I want to make sure that when I flip the switch, the lights turn on, and when I turn the faucet, the water comes out. And this, they read, and rightfully so in some cases, a little bit hyperbolically in others, that data center issue is going to have a direct impact on that. Mm-hmm. And so, Sarah, I guess all that to say is that the question that I would have emerging from that then is, do we see a model, and you can name names or not, but do we see a model of this, I would say, true moderate take? And I don't mean, and, obviously, I made the joke earlier about David French because he, fell for basically the shtick that we have coming out during the campaign. But is there perhaps a model or an actual example of a true moderate that could probably play equally well in both the Republican and Democrat sides? Again, could be one or the other, but threatens to take enough from the other side so as to be politically viable.
I think you see glimmers of it in a lot of candidates. I don't know if anyone has really cracked the code fully. And I think a lot of that comes into once you start playing politics, you start playing politics. And it's so easy to get caught up in that political bubble that you forget that most of Americans don't talk politics every day. And
the healthy ones don't, yeah. Right. Unlike us.
Right.
Yeah.
The ones that we trust don't, right?
Yeah.
But it's really important, I think, for candidates and for elected officials to be reminded of that. And also for media to be reminded of that. It's so easy for things to just get caught up in the policy that doesn't really connect with people. And once the campaigns are done, I think a lot of leaders really lose that connection to the people. I remember working on Congresswoman Mia Love's campaign, and she would get, so caught up in a lot of the work in Washington, really stressful. And then we would bring her in and she'd be able to actually talk to constituents. And it was like a breath of fresh air for her to be reminded that the issues of the people are unfortunately not the issues of Washington. That is a extremely powerful message for any candidate. The best thing you can do is to actually boots on the ground, go talk to people, go talk to your constituents, leave the political consultants behind and listen to the people. If you want to connect with them, that's where you have to go.
Yeah, Sarah, your boss talks about this a lot, and I was on a panel with him. I interviewed him for an event last year. He talks about the 10-10-80, right? And it's 10 on the far left, 10 on the far right, and then the 80% of everybody else who's in the middle. The issue is that the 10-10 are constantly fighting each other, like having a knockdown, drag out death battle. And so and because the media wants to cover that, and that's the interesting thing is that conflict that people want to follow. They determine the sides, the contours of the debate on those things. And while there might be in the middle, maybe it's not 80%, maybe it's 60 or 50 who would agree on some kind of balanced approach or balanced solution, the fact is that the people who stand up, on the floor of Congress are the 10 and the 10, then start the mudslinging. And then certainly once you get into the election season, it's the messages and the issues that reflect the 10 and the 10. And so we all, you do one of two things. Either you get consumed by it and you think, oh, my opponent is a Nazi, or you think my opponent is is the second coming of Mao, and so you either get into it and that's what you think, or you tune it out and you say, I'm not going to pay attention. I think this is what worries a lot of, consultants that work in politics is those people that tune it out until the last minute are the people who ultimately make ultimately decide which way the election goes in a lot of elections, maybe not in Texas necessarily, but they do decide whether or not, you have a Republican or Democrat majority in Congress, which is a big deal. But those people tune it out until the last 2 weeks because they just hate the far left and the far right, attacking each other. And I think, to Sarah's advice, how do you navigate that? Maybe there's a candidate out there or somebody out there who can, lift up everybody's eyes and say, hey, this is what we should be talking about instead of getting down there in the mud. Any progress towards that? I mean, it's kind of just restating Derek's question, but do you see anybody? I mean, since you guys talk about the 10-10-80 a lot, I'm curious if you're actually seeing any trends where people are starting to use that as part of their strategy.
Yeah, I think what's a real challenge is that common sense doesn't raise money. And so people don't go there.
Yeah.
Clip that.
I think the other thing that's hard is that there are polls and data released every day that is out of alignment with what the American people actually believe. And politics is downstream from data. So when there are polls released that seem like, oh, is 80% of Americans really want men playing in girls' sports? That data becomes so confusing when it's not aligned with what you as an individual really think. Now, I just made that number up, but it's just an example of if you see a media headline that is so out of touch with what you believe, you become ostracized. And then why would you even want to play in politics? Because you don't think that there's a spot where you belong, because either side seems so far out of line. So I think that it's not just, is there a single candidate who can sell common sense and who can be respectful of the American people, but it's, are there candidates on both sides who can do that? And are there media outlets who can support this type of rhetoric? Because everyone, end of the day, is either raising money so they can run again, or they're trying to hit advertising spend. And I think there just needs to come a shift of common sense. We can sell common sense. We can be genuinely good people with good intentions, even in politics. And until I think both sides start to figure that out, you're going to continue to see those loud voices on the far right and the far left take over everybody else and really ostracize people from even being engaged in the conversation.
Bringing it back to Texas, Derek, this one's going to start with you, but I'd like to get Sarah's thoughts on this too. There's so many fascinating things about the election in Texas. Once you really start digging around, there are a lot of things that are happening this year that haven't happened in a long time. I mentioned the open seats among the statewide. So with Sid Miller losing his primary, that one will be open, or at least it'll be a new candidate, new Republican running against a Democrat. So there's at least three of the 7 statewide. And then if Paxton wins, there'll be 4. 4 of the 7 statewides will be effectively open seats, which has just not ever happened, in a long time.
Well, whether he does or not, this would be the year the AG would be up, so that's open.
Yeah, so that's the U.S. Senate seat.
No.
Yeah,
Texas AG.
Yeah, Texas AG is open. So we've got comptroller and AG that are definitely open. Ag, now that Sid Miller has lost the primary, and then potentially the U.S. Senate seat. So you really only have Abbott, Patrick, and Don Buckingham who are running for re-election in the statewide, which is fascinating that we have potentially 4 of the 7 statewides that are open. The other fascinating thing about the statewides is that 5 of the 7 candidates on the Democrat side come directly from the state legislature. And as you know, over the last 3 sessions, Texas has been one of the strongest leaders on passing conservative reforms, particularly amongst the hot button issues that we're debating right now. So things like preventing gender modification, pushing back against the trans agenda, the indoctrination in our schools, DEI and higher ed, limiting, we have some of the strongest limits on abortion, and then of course immigration. These are all the hot button issues. And we've passed legislation through the House and the Senate and signed by the governor that has led the nation on this stuff, which means that all 5 of those Democrat candidates that are running statewide have contemporary recent votes on all of those hot button issues. So it's not something that they can hide from. So I'm wondering, is that how do they... you look at a campaign like Talarico's and you think, well, he's doing something really different there with his campaign. Maybe it's out of necessity because there's not really any issues that he could run. There's no record for him to run on because all of those issues that I just described are at minimum 70-30 issues, that favor the right than favor the left. So maybe, his consultants looked at his, record and thought, man, this is not something that we can run on. Gina Hinojosa, governor, is kind of running on public education and funding that, which, there's, you dig down a little bit deeper and there's not much substance to her criticisms. I'm wondering if seeing, having studied the legislature and been around when all those votes taken, does that seem like a real or a real problem for the left as they go into the November election?
Brian, I think it's cute that you think that the public's pulling vote sheets and stuff. But I get what you're saying in terms of liability.
But my point about starting with the open seats is right now they're still defining themselves, on who they are, and at some point they're going to say, well, what did you vote for? What did you support? And then all this stuff is going to come out.
Yeah, and I think that, but I think especially as we've seen multiple times, and if you just look at the candidates who have kind of risen to these basically to drink from the poison chalice, we're just going to be honest, for the Texas statewides, it's not necessarily a collective of campaigns built upon substance. I don't think, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see Vicki Goodwin getting out there and saying Lieutenant Governor Patrick thinks this about casinos and marijuana and the lottery, and here's my contrary position and why. It's just basically, I'm not him. My hat is blue. His hat is red. Vote for me. And that's generally the issue that we see here in the state when it comes to statewide campaigns. To Representative Talarico's credit, yeah, he's just trying something different. But we look at the folks in the House specifically, and when they try to go for, I wouldn't even say for the Senate, because that's that's still a localized campaign, less localized than a House campaign, obviously. But that's still a local focused campaign, focusing on local issues, whether they have the record or not. But when you go statewide, specifically statewide from the House, not only do you have that voting record that you rightfully highlight, you also have, unless you made waves, and it takes a lot for a House member of any stripe, no matter how long they've been there, to make waves on a particular issue that reach shores outside of this narrow, bay that we're in here in the political side, then you're going to come in with almost zero name ID versus the incumbent that you're challenging. Or even in an open seat, it's, again, there's a state default, to Sarah's point, on policy preferences on so many of these things. And so it's almost like not only is there not really a way to go if you're just doing the up or out thing, there's really almost no portfolio to draw from. And to be honest with you, and this isn't a Republican or Democrat thing, because I think both sides have the same issue, and the amount of open seats kind of reveal this, the benches are thin too. Different reason for different sides. But I think that we have, there's not a lot of quality talent kind of coming up. And the ones that do tend to grab the headlines. They do tend to have, I would say draw a lot of attention to that particular race, whether the race is close or not, simply because of the I would say the content of the campaign.
Yeah, and one of their up and coming sides was Jasmine Crockett, and now she's not even going to be on the ballot this year.
I'm sorry, that is going to be propaganda. I will not, because I've been around, and since she's not a candidate, I can opine on this now. She has been around in the legislature for a while, I guess, for one session more than she was in Congress for. Or she was in one for each. The issue is everything around that campaign was entirely manufactured by the media. There was never, she got when Edie I can't remember the congressman she replaced.
Allred. That she replaced.
Yeah, stepped aside.
Is it Veazey?
Was it
Veazey?
No, it was.
Anyway,
Edie, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I'm unfortunately not
Aren't
terribly
you guys
familiar with
or something. Come on.
Yeah, but that being said, she handpicked her to be the successor, and that was the end of the race right there. And it wasn't based on merit or anything, because if you look at unimpressive records coming out of the Texas House, that is going to be a hard one to beat. Because simply, there was nothing there. It was. I remember the beginning of the campaign, it was, I filed 50 bills in this particular area, left the House with 0 bills passed. Wow. And every freshman gets a gimme, and didn't get a gimme.
But your larger point is to pour cold water on my pipe dream, apparently, wishful thinking that we would have a substantive debate over policy going into November.
No, quite the opposite. I'm saying that in the areas where there are substance and there is a bench, you are seeing this debate. I'm thinking, South Bexar County, George Borrego, friend of the pod, I think we could say, a former colleague of ours, and Kristen Carranza are debating actively right now, specifically on the education and property tax side. And we're actually seeing that debate play out instead of look at my red hat, look at my blue hat. Similarly, we're going to see similar things up in Plano as well, and some of these other tighter areas. And so if anything, Brian, I think that you should be buoyed. You should be ebullient that we are actually going to have in areas where it's going to matter, that property, I was going to say property taxes, but that discussion on property taxes, schooling, what have you, as opposed to just, get in line behind your team.
Sarah, what do you think? What is the prospects for having a substance-filled election? I think, again, my argument would be you've got all these open seats. People are going to be learning about the records and learning about, the positions that people take. It's not just, I've been here, vote for me again. I think we have an opportunity to have a real substantive discussion about a lot of, big issues in Texas. We feel like we lead the way on substantive issues in a place like Texas. So what do you see? Do you think it, like most elections, just comes down to personality and who you'd like to have a beer with?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough season for these new candidates because there is so much turnover. When you don't have a lot of name recognition, that can benefit you, depending on I think who is at the top of the ballot. If you're a smaller race, it can benefit you because people will just vote down ballot. But there's going to be a lot of people pining for space, for people's attention. And so that's going to be a big challenge. Name recognition is going to be the first thing. And can we have a substantive debate? Can we have a substantive election cycle? Potentially, but it kind of all comes down to what are the candidates going to focus on and what are they going to focus on about their opponents. It's really easy to get caught up in the thick of thin things when we're all just trying to get our name out there. So it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds.
All right. So for last question, let's expand it out a little bit. Nationwide, do you see any, you said the economy is number one. That probably won't change. Iran, I heard Scott say this morning that, you've got to, the best thing that Trump could do is end the excursion, I guess they're calling it now, end the excursion and the fighting as much as possible and come out with some kind of positive win for America over in Iran. But in terms of big trends, is there anything we're missing? Is it just the typical stuff in a non-presidential year, or are there any other big issues that you think will be trending across the country that we need to keep an eye on?
Yeah, just like you said, if things don't calm down quickly in Iran, that's going to be a big issue, and the economy will always be the second. It's a boring answer, but it's true. How people feel about their personal finances is the biggest motivator going into the polls. And unfortunately, if the economy stays exactly how it is right now, it's going to be tight. It's going to be tight for the Republicans. If the economy gets any worse, and if we're still fighting in Iran by the time we get to November, it's likely the Democrats are going to have a pretty good night. That doesn't mean that it's smooth sailing to win the Senate, but Republicans really are going to have to work hard on their messaging to show how the work that they've done is helping people's bottom line. That's the boring but real answer. It's the economy. And so it'll be really interesting to see how Iran impacts that, and can the Republicans get the message out that what they're doing is helping American families.
Well, thank you for that. We'll have to leave it there. I'm not going to make you do any predictions that you can be wrong or right about, but we might. Once the election happens, maybe we'll have you back on to talk about all what the data says and what happened here in Texas. So thanks you very much for being on. Thank you for being with us, Sarah, today.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Excellent. All right. And thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Derek, for me and Derek. As always, thank you for listening and watching. We'll see you next time. In the immortal words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.